Welcome to another Tuesday train with the 2MK team. Tuesday train, as always, means Guilty Gear, and we are working on our matchups once again. Matchup work takes a lot out of you, so given the fact that we basically train Guilty Gear once a week, we're going to put our all into it for the upcoming event Combo Breaker. This is a loser stays on beginner to intermediate lobby on the US East Coast. If you're anywhere in that area though, you can join up. We're not that picky about the lag. The consistency of your connection is far more important than anything else. You can find the information on the room ID and password in our tweet. On our Twitter account 2_MK_FGC. And of course, it should also be in the stream title. So of course we're back to Answer, Sim, and as usual Kai. We expect to see Slayer a bit later, maybe more Axel. Getting matchup knowledge against more obscure characters requires a lot more dedication to Guilty Gear than a lot of people can find the time for. Fortunately for us, most of the team plays characters who at least have relatively standard game plans if you played other fighting games. So the high level trickery you'll find facing off with Zato or Venom is not as likely. Since mostly the team is working on matchups they already basically understand, I'm likely to have a bit less to say this week until we get joined by possibly a Johnny. I think that they were around last time. Or anyone else who chooses to join up and add to our knowledge. Obviously, a lot of what I do say will mostly be repeats to act as spotter, help the team with their remembering of things that are important in their matchups. If you do join and I say anything that is incorrect based on your character, please let me know. And if you're just watching and don't know if you'll be able to, the lounge usually goes on for about 3 hours from now. So for those who get home relatively early on the East Coast, there's usually at least some time. We're seeing some good spacing play from Answer today. And the only thing holding Kansuki Dynasty back in this, I believe, would be that when Kai retreats, as Omni Rabbit often does, and generally Kai will do, Answer has a moment to set up whatever purchase he wants to. Even if they were already out, he can replace them if he managed to move around a little bit. And this is probably more important than most of his other options. It's based on understanding that Kai's main game plan, once under pressure from Answer, involves moving away. It's a matter of understanding when the offensive and defensive styles of play have shifted so that you can get what you need out of it. So, a matter of watching the ranges, understanding that when Kai is far away, his mindset is different from when he's been in a block string, and so on. This is, again, important in all fighting games, and you need to try to learn it as you go, and slow down your play even if that's necessary in order to keep track of it properly. Sin is mostly the same thing, just with a different setting of purchase. Answer versus Sin is a match where we are more likely to see that sort of thing coming into play, because they both have options from long range. Even though those options can be slow, neither has a strong option to just beat the other's option. Sin, for the most part, can only vault over when Answer is throwing his cards for the lockdown, and depending on which cards Answer has out, this won't work either. Answer in turn can't really just go to whatever perch he wants while Sin is able to do his long-range overhead. In that case, for example, we see that as long as Kai is strongly tilted in the defensive mindset, even perches won't help Answer get in unless Answer is patient enough to try to delay the method used. Most of Answer's attacks bring him close enough to Kai that Kai can counterattack. And Kai knows this, so he just stays quiet and waits for it to happen. And while Answer is not a particularly linear character in terms of how he attacks, opening people up takes a lot more understanding of the character, and opening Kai up in particular is among the hardest things to do in this game, simply because of the spaces he can keep you from occupying. It's not because Kai's defense specifically is all that great in every way, but rather that Kai stops you from getting to places where you could even begin your mix-ups. Requiring you to watch for when Kai thinks it's his turn to attack, or the player is distracted. Answer's various teleportation options don't work as well on Kai because, unlike most zoner characters, he doesn't commit as hard to particular things or relatively slower normals. And the few he has tend to interrupt anything that happens. A note for those who are not too familiar with this type of game is that there are definitely characters who have regular moves, just normals, that have momentum that is decided by whether or not your character was walking or running at the time you started them. So for example, that move, which Sin uses to slide across slightly, is actually different in terms of its range when Sin is running first. There are also a bunch of other little things that can affect how far that move goes. Understanding which of your moves are sliding moves and which are not, or at least which of them lose momentum quickly when you press them, helps you with playing footsies against certain characters when you have ended up really far out. Usually these moves are easy to defend against, and they only work on opponents who are more likely to be twitchy about things. But because they slide forward, depending on how the opponent's counterattack is launched, they may trade or cause their move to entirely miss, though most moves that would be used don't actually miss. For Sin and Answer, this is particularly effective because both of them can combo relatively well off those moves. In Sin's case, for example, he can actually combo from it into itself on counter hit. And Answer may have to use a different move, but it's functionally the same. He has dash forward style moves, where on counter hit he can keep going and get a lot of space control out of it. Other characters use this for their dashes and air dashes. So be sure to watch out for what type of run your character has, how good it is, and how much momentum ends up happening when you use it. Mastering such moves such that they hit at the tip of the hitbox leaves you close to unpunishable for a lot of them. Or you can whiff them in ways that would whiff punish an opponent's attempt to stop you, while not putting you in too much danger. This of course depends on the opponent's normals and what they try to use to cause you problems, but it is effective on a lot of different buttons that you would expect to not be all that useful. And since you don't tend to get punished too heavily for doing it, since most people will keep you out with long pokes that don't combo into anything themselves, you're often safe enough testing out the waters with those moves first rather than trying to get in on an opponent completely. Same thing goes for certain jumping normals out of your air dashes. If you realize you want to make an approach, you have an approach move that converts and one that doesn't. The one that doesn't is probably safer in some way, and therefore you can afford to do it. Moves like that are also more likely to cause your opponent to take steps to prevent you from ever using them, which in turn often leaves them open for something else. Sin's Vault, for example, easily mixes up with those if the opponent has been in some way encouraged to throw fireballs or something similar because of the dash forward movement. And given that Sin has 3 options there, it's easier still for him to do this. This is likely to put the opponent into a defensive mindset altogether, where they do not want to take a lot of actions at all against Sin, allowing him to walk in on them, get a lot of food to eat, and so on. Pay attention to when your opponent's mindset has become defensive due to your own good mix-ups in offense. And in games like Guilty Gear, where you often have some benefit you can take just from opponents standing around in neutral, take that whenever you can. as demonstrated there, when the opponent pauses because they are expecting you to keep up your offense. Just take your time, have a snack, build up your power in some way. As you can see here, as one gets more and more used to this concept, the neutral becomes more daring and contains more opportunities to convert into bigger damage. Figuring out the combos that are best from those moments is how you can improve your skill and outputs in the game. It's very important to recognize which situations you often end up in so that you can decide which combos to focus on learning. Many of us have relatively limited time to play our fighting games lately or are interested in multiple games. And therefore, understanding how to make the most progress in the shortest space of time is not only good for morale, but simply a necessity in our current golden era of fighting games. Our suggestion, therefore, is that one learns to play neutral as well as possible first, and from that, watch for your experience to see where your style leads you in terms of stray hits that you can convert into damage, combos you should learn as a result of that, and so on. Obviously, as neutral becomes more daring, bigger damage and stranger situations also occur, giving you a lot more options for opening your opponent up or, more importantly, for reacting with things that lead into big damage when your opponent has misspaced or mistimed themselves. Emotionally, the shift here is often one that newer players have problems with because it goes from feeling as if you know what you're doing to getting bodied, basically. But this doesn't always happen because of a flaw in your play beyond the obvious lack of practice in whiffing or landing very specific attacks. Your opponent is just becoming more and more aware of the spacings that you yourself are learning. When enough of these spaces have been learnt, you're going to have to evolve yourself, and that is what helps you level up. Similarly, over time, in longer sets or with opponents with whom you're familiar, the feelings of when attack and defense phases are happening shift over time, as your opponent sees more and more often that you stop your offense and they need to be ready to go on offense themselves. That said, this is usually a reaction, and if you are in the right space, you can make use of this as well. Use this to push the limits of your training partners so that you can both improve. Learning your opponent's adapted approach vectors also often shifts whether or not you need to use unfamiliar buttons in order to check those approaches. One of the hardest things for us to learn in most fighting games is to not just hit our pet button for keeping people out, because they will find a way in around it. Once you've reached that point in matches and become comfortable, the next phase is normally about understanding how to reposition yourself off of knockdowns that don't lead to anything, to maximize the amount of confusion and stress you can put on the opponent. This is a level of trickery that is used more so by mid-level players who have been through lots of training on this sort of thing. You can expect that against such players, waking up normally may in fact be to your detriment, because the chances are that while you were being knocked down and possibly watching your own character to figure out where you were going to end up, they were also doing the same and repositioning themselves just a bit so that your normal wake up becomes a bad idea. One such situation, if you are not specifically great at the Oki for your character, the wake up game, is to look for opportunities to get your opponent, if they are a bit twitchy, with your crouching dust, which will usually knock them off their feet. Once you have this, most people will wake up with something, because for most characters, that is simply not very good in terms of wake up pressure. It allows you to bait certain wake up with some success. And if your opponent is worried about that, you can go for some completely unsafe and unreal mix-up things. Once you've established to your opponent that you have some trickery up your sleeve. Even if you don't know any of the Oki from a particular knockdown, just threatening or moving to a spacing that you could do something good from, if you know the optimal spacing for one of your moves, go exactly to that space and decide at the last moment really if you're going to use the move or not. If you do so, you're often able to get some success just in terms of making them nervous, making them want to block more on their wake up. And this allows you to do stranger wake up pressure against mid-level players to experiment with the Oki that you don't yet know. This match is one of the most important matches in Guilty Gear for understanding the relative attack and defense mindset of each player. This is because Kai can't open Sin up from very far away, and Sin can't open Kai up from mid-range very easily. Both of them are therefore looking for a way to bait the other into responding to something that is incorrect. And this requires a lot of spacing understanding, both in terms of how to force your opponent to think you're attacking, and monitoring when your opponent has probably switched their own mental state. Since both characters have good ways through the other's moves in a lot of situations, understanding which move your opponent is likely to do when their mindset changes is also useful. For example, in that case, while Kai normally slides under that, there is a range at which the startup of Kai's move is a little too slow to easily do it, leading to Sin being able to land that super even though he normally shouldn't be able to. That is more so a matter of spacing and understanding when Kai will be in a position to make it possible than it is about any function of the super itself. You can't just do the move in neutral and expect it to work. You have to set up both a situation and a spacing to make it a good idea. That, for example, was simply defending long enough in the corner to have the opponent think in terms of attacking, and then closing it out with basically Sin's equivalent of a full screen frame trap. A lot of the time, what seems to be random is more so about the opponent deciding that it is their timing for doing the thing in question, and you simply not being able to recognize why it was that their mindset or plan changed. You shouldn't worry too much about this at the beginning in terms of playing these games. Your natural style will evolve out of it if you don't push too hard toward winning. After all, in the end, it's highly likely that you're going to be doing this for a long time before you can consider yourself particularly good. So there's no need to rush yourself through that. You might as well take some time to develop the way you want to play rather than trying to win all the time and not ending up developing any style of your own. Well, there's the usual 40-second timeout, so probably controller died or something. So a bit of flashiness and we move on to the next match. I think the skip timer is at 30 seconds. And looks like we're back.
が伝え聞く忍びの技か。まさに虚実混交。曖昧。
As you can see, this matchup is a lot about understanding when one can move relative to Axel. Because even though Answer has the range, patience is the key to this matchup. It's quite easy to get to Axel if you are paying enough attention to their movements. However, if you are pushed more towards moving because you haven't been allowed to move so far, it's much harder to get in because he will just keep on sticking out buttons. Here we see an example of some good, simple, spaced wake-up games. Moving oneself to the position where your own crouching dust hits means that you can often attack someone with your crouching dust in this game on their wake-up. This is effective for many reasons. First of all, being that it is a low when they're not expecting it. Secondly, that at maximum range, most crouching dust are not all that punishable. They don't lead to anything much, but it is enough to force your opponent to think about blocking on wake up long before the wake up actually happens. It's also a good way to maintain spacing positions that lead to you having advantage in the long term, both in terms of meter and in keeping people in the corner, for example. Depending on your character and what they use to build up their flow, this can be an extremely strong tactic to use. Even for those whose crouching dust is not as safe or as easy to space, you might still get quite a bit of mileage out of this style because your opponent is so unlikely to just block in that particular way on wake up until you've given them a reason to do so. So it's easy to set it up so that the first knockdown or two can lead to just you doing that. As you can gain more and more advantage, your understanding of your opponent's character increases as well. This allows you to expand your thinking beyond just trying to hit your opponent wherever they are, and being able to think about what you can get away with or where they are likely to be in certain situations, solving a lot of the problems one has when getting into a new fighting game, of basically not knowing what to do and not being able to get your opponent to do what you want them to do in return. Understanding how to be patient in these games is heavily dependent on understanding when your opponent has to stop attacking, or is likely to stop attacking. You learn the first, and the second becomes relatively clear after a while. Against Slayer, for example, there's a lot of good to be had from getting out of his stuff with just vault from Sin after a certain amount of blocking. But understanding what you can vault out of is a matter of patience and watching enough to clarify this to yourself. Because Slayer does obviously have moves that stop vault from being effective, and he has the option to stop attacking and wait for you to vault, obviously. That said, there's still a lot to be said for just moving in the right position and setting up your vault escape. Especially since Slayer's moves that do reach you are not generally that strong. Once you're out, it's easy for Sin to backdash, to use the entire rest of the screen to catch back up on health and whatever other resources he needs, and turn the match back around. To the point where, unless the Slayer player is very, very clear on what they want to do in the corner, it's relatively easy for Sin to win by letting himself get cornered, if you are not impatient about it. part of the reason why many of the old guard, as you could put it, are so happy about older fighting games is because older fighting games don't have as many options available for movement, and therefore, just playing them causes all of these interactions mentally to occur. You can't get away from it unless you are really, really not paying attention. Newer games tend to have a lot more options and a lot more flows because, as we all expanded our understanding of fighting games, we wanted things to become more complex and interesting. However, most of the older players have built on that core principle of watching spacing, understanding rhythm of attack, and so on. So to them, it comes a lot more naturally to just pick up all of these things automatically and build on them. Whereas newer players are often watching a massive number of things happening on the screen and can easily become convinced that that is what the game is supposed to be like or about, without understanding the level of fundamentals required to do it. Effectively, anyway. As characters gain more and more moves, as games gain more and more mechanics, the amount of time that the player is able to spend doing very basic things for long periods doesn't necessarily diminish, but it can certainly feel like it does. An easy way to tell if you are capable of understanding this at your current level or not is to just watch older games, particularly the quintessential Street Fighter Super Turbo. If you find Super Turbo to be dry, you probably need to understand this a little bit better. That's not a universal thing, but I meant as a generality, the game as a whole, not this character versus this character or some matchup you don't like watching. If you can watch Street Fighter Super Turbo and think, I don't know what's going on, it looks like they're just repeating themselves, you might need to spend a little more time working on understanding spacing and attack timings. I'm not necessarily suggesting you need to go play Super Turbo, but chances are that it is at least somewhat an indication that you are not seeing everything that is going into those decisions, and therefore in higher level games you also have the same problem. It does take a while to reach the point where wiggling back and forth in neutral actually is footsies and not just wiggling. But of course you can expand your understanding of these concepts in just about any game if you give yourself enough time. The key is to release yourself from the feeling that you must do a lot of things, that you must do those things quickly, that your opponent is going to win if you don't do lots of different things. Mostly these are not true.
文武両道彩色権利何をやってますギャーってのは勝つ喜びより負ける楽観の方が大きそうだ。メンゴ恨みっこなしだ。デュエルワンやっまえ。いい勝負でした。はい、勝ちだ。
これが伝え聞く忍びの技か。まさに虚実混交。
Understanding the rhythm of each opponent and each character is also harder in this particular sort of thing. That said, again, newer games tend to be more complex and push more on your capacity to do this. Make sure you're comfortable with your training partners before spending a lot of energy on other options for training, or at least make sure that you understand every reason they do the things they do, even if those things they do aren't necessarily the best. If you know what they should be doing, make sure you understand why they should be doing it.
環境保全の観点と公共性維持の両立は課題ですね。差し当たり害獣の対応なのですが、それが絶滅危惧種の場合はどうしたものかと。はい、偶然捕獲しまして。
In games known as anime games, there is often a principle called proration, and proration is about learning which combos get to do more damage because they started with a button with lower or higher, depending on how you look at it, proration. When you start a combo with a light attack, in this case, let's go with a crouching kick for Guilty Gear. It often influences how much damage the rest of the combo is able to do by altering the scaling from the very beginning. It may therefore be in your best interest to use a combo that just isn't going to do much damage to begin with, but sets up a position you like. Learning to do this over time and mentally adapt to your combo paths based on what move it was that started the combo will also help you pay more attention to your spacing and improve at the game in general. That is a good example of proration coming into play. 5 quick light attacks caused Answer's super move to do much less damage than it normally does by itself. And depending on the move's interaction with the scaling, because not all things with proration have scaling, you could manage to drastically reduce the damage of a combo by using a move that has high proration to start, again, or low, depending on how you look at it. And furthermore, scales very heavily when repeated. Most games with combo scaling will manage this either way, but this sort of game has a lot more of it in a lot shorter spaces of time, allowing you to end up with very low damage attacks as a result of it. Whereas the same move there, even with Slayer's high guts rating, which basically influences how much damage he takes when his life gets lower, you can see it changes quite a lot. But there is another use for moves like this. You can hit them when you have the absolute intention for your opponent to block them, because of the pushback they give you. And if you do this, it means you often don't need to learn any actual damaging combo. It might even be better for you not to build up any expectation at all. This is often true in anime-style games because the pushback you get from the move that you hit with is intended to help you out anyway, as you can see there. Answer's Crouching Dust is not only cancelable in certain situations, it's extremely useful for saving him from situations simply because the knockback on it pushes him out of Slayer's moves. He can hit it just to make sure that Slayer is not close enough to him to cause any problems. Therefore, going from multiple of his Crouching Punch into his Crouching Dust, regardless of whether or not it hit or was blocked, allows you to keep your mind on the rest of the match while automatically doing a certain thing. It is not that autopilot as a whole is naturally bad, it's that you have to decide and learn which options are good autopilot and which are not, so that you can spend your time maximizing your thinking during your autopilot phases and make sure that you do the correct thing when you don't have autopilot as a main option. Overall, it's important to remember to take your training and your improvement in these games in steps. Even if you know all of the steps, it doesn't often make sense to try to do them all at once. Learning each piece of a matchup and each resource you have available to you can take quite some time. So trying to focus on doing them all is a lot different than just understanding them all.
スレイヤの妙竹林にあいて読める。
One can also see in this matchup the amount of mileage and use that Answer gets out of his crouching dust even when it is blocked. Once again, not every character has this sort of thing as an option for themselves, but when you do have a button that has good pushback, you shouldn't really be worried about trying to open your opponent up, so much as you should if you're using that button for spacing and figuring out what to do once you're at that space. All you have to do, generally, is figure out faster than your opponent what your options are, and obviously you'll choose moves that give you spacings that have good advantage to you in the first place. Sometimes just one button can change an entire matchup. You'll note here, for example, that being able to use Answer's Crouching Dust in this matchup, especially with Purchase up, leads to a strong mix-up on the approach, with Slayer underneath one in such a way that he can't tell whether or not Answer is going to actually perch on it, or just go for a jumping attack. Since these two things are functionally blocked differently, even though you could react to both of them. It is another piece of the puzzle for the matchup that Answer is able to add on. The calmer you are able to become in your matches by finding these little things to make yourself comfortable, the more you can spend time thinking about how to approach the matchup and what actual mix-ups and stylistic things you can build up. Your opponent in turn has to either manage to do the same thing or lose simply by being more flustered than you. Which, as any veteran fighting game player will tell you, is a very real way to lose. Your mental stamina and ability to stay calm in complex situations far outweighs a lot of your capacity to do combos in a lot of modern fighting games. In fact, technically it's for all fighting games, it's just that older fighting games didn't have as many combos. Understanding how your dust button functions in this game, not what dust does, but how your particular character's dust helps them either standing or crouching. Even though the move is slow and often only does one thing, sometimes that one thing is the thing you need the most. You should therefore pay as much attention as possible to those setups. Putting yourself in your opponent's place may also help you improve in these situations, because it's easy to recognize when they had a response and simply didn't use it because of expecting something else from you. At high levels, it is obviously useful to be able to tell when you have made the right decision and misled your opponent, but understanding that at lower levels, sometimes they're just guessing and you happen to be winning out by that, will help you tune up your spacing so that you make sure it does not happen too often. You want your mix-ups to be as real as possible.
はしたなようだがオードブルでは満足できなくてね。スレイヤー勝ちだ。ストレート。若さが光るた
恨みっこなしだ。デュエル1
ちょっと前にさ、人間は外見や所作で大体中身がわかる的な本が流行ったわけよ。興味もあったし欲しかったんだけど、なんか今日いらなくなったわ。ジャックをアクセルさあ進もうぜ。
パフォーマンスも把握しとくか。まあいいわ。応戦します。
手加減してくれよ。恨み殺しだ。デュエルワンやった
マジシャンね、ランサーね。マジシャンね、ランサーね。完成モーメント。
And here we have that terrifying moment where Jacko has trapped in her army. Understanding the control required for this, both when to start and stop your offense, and how to keep your opponent in the right space on the screen that they have to put up with the army regenerating, is key to mastering this character. Over time, one has to build up an understanding of the block stun, hit stun, and movement of minions in order to know when to actually stay close, since the opponent's best option in almost all cases is to use their most invincible or heavy move to hope that they clip Jacko, basically because they're stuck in block stun for so long that they know it won't come out until it could. And most of the time, because of the way minions move, this does not result in them getting hit while trying, it results in Jacko getting hit and the end of the pressure. Another classic Kai versus Jacko timeout, based on some very patient play on both sides. In this matchup, paying attention to how Jackal chooses to play neutral gives you the understanding of when to try to destroy houses. When Jackal's neutral becomes less predictable, so too does your timing for attempting to counterattack.
ちょっと前にさ、人間は外見や所作で大体中身が全力で来ることだ。クールな負け方考えとくな。恨みっこなしだ。デュエルワンやっちまえ。そこにそらったそらよそらよここだそこ使いどこを見ているどこを見ている
Playing this sort of match so close to the cuff means that your opponent's awareness is tested very heavily throughout the match. Fortunately for most of us, games with large space between the characters allow our awareness a lot of comfort in terms of what we can do, because we don't have to block or worry about what happens if we start to do a move or try to do a move and then decide, no, that probably wasn't actually a good idea. Games like this where you have that space to tell yourself, I probably shouldn't do this, having let go of your block just long enough to contemplate doing it, are a little bit easier than games where pressure is heavy and letting go of block to try something and then reconsidering will usually result in you getting hit. Some strongly executed combos there, showing off Axel's damage capacity.
スーパースターを真似るってところは100点だ。でも負けてしょげんな。帰る家がなくても俺様は笑顔だぜ。
ながら冥府はいず下道が笑
We can see here a situation similar to what was mentioned before. In this particular matchup, Viking gets a specific approach type that ends up with her hitting from the air and landing a certain type of attack really often. So, as an example, if one wanted to improve your skills and win rate in this matchup, you could primarily focus on the combo that is done from that particular interaction. It might not be useful in a lot of other places, but is not only useful here as a generality, but comes up often enough that one would get to practice it. Lack of that combo means that over time, the neutral goes in the favor of Axel, but not specifically because one is playing poorly, but simply because you haven't optimized the damage on a particular approach that an opponent forces you to use. This is one of the easiest ways to deal with the situation, one of the easiest things to shift in your own play. Simply doing more work on a certain combo because the situation for that combo comes up often. As you can see, Baiken's long range mix-ups help a lot here, but the aforementioned spacing relative to her claw changes the matchup quite heavily. Baiken's claw spacings are so disadvantageous to most Kai players that she just gets to attack for free at that range. Kai does have options, but they are so risky that the general mindset of someone who plays Kai seriously shifts toward the sort of person that doesn't do this very often, and it takes conscious effort to make sure that they have done the right thing. That tiny moment of hesitation that will appear when facing this sort of Baiken can lead to a lot of trouble once Baiken becomes aware of where the Kai's movement flow goes. Beyond that, a simple matter of keeping him out with her tatami mat and a few of her other normals is enough to basically shut down a lot of Kai's motion and force him into almost constant defense mode. Whether or not Viking can capitalize on this, of course, is based on their understanding of the opposing player and how much meter they have at any given time, but as a strategy for taking on this matchup, it certainly is among the better ones, until the Kai player decides that they're going to go all ham. Of course, it does lead to extremely long matches like this one, and some timeouts.
足かせのついた刀ではあなたの実力が陰るだけですよ。マイケル、まずはアクセル。さあ楽しもうぜ。お頼み申す。お頼み申す。卒しながら冥府
ンな競技でも時間が経つと新記録って出るじゃん。多分最悪な心境もいつか桁外れな最悪を生んじまうんだ。
マイケル、マサ、カイ。さあ楽しもうぜ。
お頼み申す。お頼み申す。
恨みっこなしだ。デュエルワン、やっちまえ。どうして油断した。
One of the most useful things in this matchup for Baiken regarding that claw is that Kai's tendency to retreat at certain spaces means that he will get clipped by it while on his way out, and can't afford to throw out any buttons on his dash because of the counterattack that would occur. Therefore, it's a matter of watching the spacing and recognizing from that spacing where Kai is in a good position and where he will end up being staggered by the claw even if he ends up trading. Since Kai does not have a whole lot of good options that don't trade with either the mat or the claw, he's forced into that defensive stance by one doing that as your primary approach to trying to play any form of neutral. Whereas, using Baiken's other buttons to move forward is for more so when you are really far away. Kai does get to deal some damage to Baiken for her attempts, but the damage he deals is actually rather small compared to what she can do to him, just off of one bad trade or one misspaced counterattack from Kai's side. Baiken's strong defense also means that Kai, who is not particularly good on offense, really doesn't have a lot of options to make her flinch either, and is mostly relying on misspaced normals from her in positions where the claw would probably have caused him more grief.
いい勝負でした。カイ、勝ちだ。ストレート。
刃に乗せる思いは
マイケル、マサ、アクセル。さあ楽しもうぜ。
お頼み。
恨みっこなしだ。デュエルワン、やっちまえ。
Axel is the same matchup but reversed, where the claw is used at spacings where you expect attacks, and Baiken can just use her standing heavy slash in situations where you would expect Axel to be retreating. Since she can get in from the air fairly often, it's a question of what air attack to use. Always remember that when your character has an air approach, the button you expect to be the most useful or to deal the most damage may not be the one you want because of the interaction between the hitbox of the button and the recovery of the opponent, when they do their own moves, of course. Here you see, for example, Baiken's ability to move in and just hit big buttons. Whereas in the other situation just now, she would have needed to throw out the claw instead because she was expecting Axel to do something. Another good option for her obviously is the mat, but the amount of damage she can get from a good claw hit is much higher than you'd expect. This is because Axel's buttons, while very effective at covering space, are relatively slow, and somehow mostly seem to have lower priority than Baiken's claw, meaning that you just get to do a lot of stuff to him. If you really think he's going to attack, just throw it out, and he will get put in a position where he no longer has advantage and feels like trying to get away. The Axel player in turn must end up feeling relatively uncomfortable because he's not at a range where any of his moves are good ideas anymore. So he spends a lot more time trying to make sure he gets to that range and gets away from Baiken. Which is technically the correct response from his side. Baiken does not have a lot of ways in on Axel from full screen that don't get at least somewhat telegraphed, other than just basically going forward and blitzing immediately. This is however relatively effective in itself. As is that. So one doesn't need to worry too much with Baiken if you have enough meter, and since there's not that much meter usage in this matchup to worry about, she continually tends to have options for moving forward against him based on her meter alone. Adding this into the mix means that Axel does not respond with his strongest attacks to everything, and then obviously allows her to further save on the meter. Remember always in Guilty Gear that in uncertain spots, the worst that will happen to you for blitzing in most situations is getting hit at the end of the blitz, not at the beginning. Similar things happen in this interaction. However, it does take quite a bit longer for both Baiken and Sin to build up meter in this matchup because Sin has such a strong capacity to attack Baiken from far away, and Baiken has a relatively strong capacity to go through Sin's attacks, so neither feels completely safe or certain in even the long range to just move in and build up some meter that way. A lot of trade and a lot of usage of resources happens on Sin's side. A lot of careful spacing on Baiken's side. As players get more and more used to doing this with each other, however, the matchup does change somewhat to involve more blitz and more dust. This is due to an awareness of the ranges at which they can replenish each other and an awareness of the tendencies that will come up while the normal thing plays out. Baiken's dust is quite long range and Sin's dust is quite hard to tell apart from certain of his other moves, making both effective for the matchup. Understanding where in the matchup they should be used is a different matter, but they're mostly buttons you want to find places to hit if you can see them. Baiken being able to use hers on run-up offense, and Sin being able to use his on defense when Baiken is at the end of block strings or not quite close enough to him yet. They both, in turn, can use their blitz at approximately the same spaces they would want to use their dust if they were worried about being countered for using the dust, making for both sides of the matchup being useful, both sides of the mix-up being useful in the matchup. The amount of mental stress on the opponent to watch and make sure that you don't have meter and therefore expect the dust and not the blitz adds some shifting around in terms of rethinking and makes it easier for the player on the offense to get something done simply because their opponent just doesn't have enough time to watch both their meter and the opponent player moving. As you get higher level, of course, being aware of your opponent's meter in the corner of your eye or whatever becomes easier, and therefore this part of the matchup becomes a lot more risky for the attacker. Neutral increases. And we see a lot more use of supers to change up that dynamic as well. As you can see, there's quite a lot of back and forth in that interaction. Training lobbies like these can be good preparation for tournaments, especially when you have a diverse cast of characters to deal with. One good reason to have this happen to you is when you have to play two different matchups with the same buttons, but in opposite timings. Forcing yourself to rapidly switch between the two can be an extremely difficult and taxing mental state. This is something seen a lot in our lounges in particular, because we have more so a gradation of characters than a drastic change from one to the other. In the middle we have Sin, Kai shifting around on the other side, Axel to the far side. Answer and Slayer take up space beyond that, but in the end, you're almost always playing some form of neutral with your different tools for that situation. But which tools you need for which part of it change by character, often reversing themselves entirely and making it difficult to remember which one you're supposed to be using. Some of us again do this by taking notes, some of us do it by working very hard on memorizing either the feeling or the technical aspect of the match. There's no specific right way to do it, but there's probably a right way for you that you should try your best to work out. As you can see, as mentioned before, a lot of very precise neutral ends up being played, between these two in particular, as the rhythm changes.
いつでもお相手します。はい、勝ちだ。ストレート。
Understanding how to force your opponent's rhythm to change is how you get them opened up in this sort of matchup where neither character has a specific advantage even when close to each other. Make sure, therefore, to reduce your own stress in these situations by allowing yourself to stay quiet if necessary. After all, being able to play slow neutral well is just as important to most fighting game players as landing their combos. Furthermore, always remember that while your opponent may have a lot of options for things you choose to do, not every opponent is going to have either a style or the mental fortitude to actually do all of those options. Most of us, when put in unfamiliar situations, will overthink our situation. And by the time you have reached the sort of person as an opponent who does not, you probably have had enough experience that you no longer need to worry about it in that particular way. So basically, don't skip the steps for yourself. You're just robbing yourself of progress. Make sure that you give yourself enough time to recognize whether or not an opponent can react to the things you do, so that you can spend more time learning how to perfect those things. If your opponent cannot in fact respond as quickly as you think they can, you may not need to try to use this as a winning strategy or abusing it too much, but you can definitely get more practice out of this than otherwise could be obtained by trying to mix it up. Now, bearing in mind that this is technically a different style of Axel than the usual, there is a slightly different way to play it. But as we are relatively close to the end of stream, I won't be going into too heavy detail on that, other than to point out that the difference is this Axel doesn't cover the middle space of the screen very much, except with specials, and tends to cover either the very far space or right up in front. This means that at a particular position on the screen, Sin is basically free to move, but he doesn't get to move in the same ways he moves against the zoning Axel. It is from mid-screen that he gets to vault, and far where he gets to move forward and then do things like his overhead. So the other, which you would normally see as his slide mixed up with beat driver, is not really something you'll see as often. This however means that Axel cannot stop Sin from maintaining a very, very healthy amount of food. Freeing him up to do a ton of really damaging moves if he can just time it right. When Sin ends up far away, all he has to really do is sit on it and eat more. One does not generally have to worry about being zoned out too heavily when you have a full calorie gauge to do various things. The difficulty is in controlling Sin's aerial momentum and understanding that he can do certain moves to stop Axel from doing certain things, but can't always get in close enough to actually launch a full assault. However, obviously if one falls into one's old autopilot, you can end up missing out on the way you actually intend to get the damage. That said, with punishes from basically full swing become available as a result of Axel's playstyle not covering a particular space very well. And note that it is no small commitment to do this. Axel cannot just do what he wants because to cover that space comprehensively requires that he jump forward, back, or neutral and stick out buttons that way, which Sin can easily see coming or recognize as something that is happening often enough to figure out what style of Axel they're facing. Always remember that your opponent's characters do have at least some limitation, and looking for that limitation may be the way that you can decide how to approach them. Similarly, in this situation, it can be very difficult for Kai to actually keep his offense going since Sin's Blitz does such a good job of flatly stopping pretty much all of it. There comes a point where Kai's attack simply stops because Sin is able to blitz through it. Therefore, it is difficult to force Sin to fear being in the corner, given that he has the options of both vaulting, using his slide, and blitzing to get out of it. And unlike against most characters, where you at least need to faultless defense, green block in order to save yourself, Sin doesn't really have to do this. Especially against Kai, who doesn't really have a good option there in the first place. Kai therefore must rely on max range things, making it easier for Sin to see through and make his escapes. Kai, however, is counting on Sin to eventually eat, or need to eat, and using that as a timing to gauge when the blitz is going to come. Sin can of course circumvent this entirely by blitzing instead of eating, or just thinking about when it should be the other way around and then reversing the expectation. This allows him to change what Kai's perception of attack and defense timings are, and by taking his father off guard, manage to win out. But now we're going into the last match of the night. Stop by tomorrow for more Street Fighter style content. Most likely finally getting back to some sandbag casuals. There are certain things that need to be ironed out before Combo Breaker. We'll be looking into what the current state of Dragon Ball FighterZ is on Thursday with Kame House Lobbies. We don't expect that much to change, honestly. And on Friday, probably more Street Fighter content, but as there's no bot and currently no updates to how we believe ThoughtBot should function, we're not expecting any changes there either, and content might be a little different. So expect a shorter stream on Friday and our usual hosting of traveling controller screens from Balance Patch in Boston. In terms of FGC news, there's some interesting interviews from Chris Tatarian talking to Daigo back at NCR. Stuff that happened at Game Over in the Dominican Republic. Gamer B, Born Free. If you just want to keep up with the latest in FGC stories, head on over to Twitter, hit up the usual suspects. Many of your favorite commentators have Twitter accounts that cover all of this and spend a lot of time retweeting stuff even if they aren't giving you content that they're on at the time. Or, much simpler, of course, head on over to Ultra Chen TV for the Tuesday show today. Much more West Coast thing, but if you're going to be up late, oh, that doesn't convert. Next week Monday will of course be more Street Fighter Mishmash Lounge. And the rotation finishes with back to another Tuesday train for more Guilty Gear action. Obviously, since the team will be doing a bit more heavy training in preparation for Combo Breaker, you will see more of them trying to actually pull out all the stops. land their big combos, and get their practice in. So if you've been holding back on joining because you feel you were too high level for the lounge, intermediate, or so on, come on in next week and see what you get. If nothing else, it will help us know where we stand. But overall, that's all for tonight. This has been Rillian for Team 2MK. Enjoy your evening, everyone.